So I am a storyteller, I'm an activist, I am a journalist, I am a facilitator. I use all of these kind of like hyphenated terms to describe my discipline because what I do really varies, but it boils down to telling stories through a diversity of mediums. I am an Oromo woman. The Oromo are and the largest indigenous population to East Africa and predominantly to Ethiopia. And being of this nation and being part of the liberation struggle connected to this identity is a huge part of my work and a huge part of what I do and who I am. Yeah, that's how I would describe, I guess, who I am in a nutshell. Why did I write this poem? Um, when you offered the invitation to humanize, in a way, this conflict that has been going on, really, it's a protracted war that is almost 150 years old, but it's also got its context of the last 5 years under this particular administration in Ethiopia. How if we could humanize this political war, this social, this economic war through poetry, I really was excited at the invitation because I'm someone who interfaces with this struggle through human stories day to day, through my work as a journalist, through my work as a facilitator, as an activist. And often when I am called to or given the opportunity to or create the opportunity to tell people about what's going on in Ethiopia, I don't want to say I'm reduced to, but that's also the language that comes to my mind, because it does feel like a reduction when people are not part of the storytelling process, but it does feel like a reduction to talking purely about narrative that's historical or movement that is kind of clinically political or
Right.
economic. And for me, this is never enough for us to really understand what is going on in Ethiopia and to motivate a kind of like visceral desire to see this conflict end. It's not enough to just talk about it statistically and factually and from a place of information or analytics. Rather, the human being and its part in this and the consequence the human being is bearing as part of this needs to be front and center. So that's why I wrote the poem, other than the fact that, you asked me to write the poem.
All right. A few interesting things that struck me about it. And I think many people will see it as a questioning of the framework of Ethiopia, or the retention of Ethiopia as a framework for achieving peace. Is that kind of what you're saying? Because you start off with, many people will be nervous that she's going to snap. Is that a reference to a breakup of Ethiopia?
Yeah, definitely it is. I think that has been the the key fear and the key dilemma that has emerged over the last 5 years is the foundations of Ethiopia as a state strong enough to come out of these multiple compounding wars and other political and social conflicts in the country, whether they are the civil wars or outside of that. Is Ethiopia's framework in terms of the social contract that exists in that country, is it strong enough to actually survive this? Or is it the weakness at that very foundation that has created these conflicts? And I think the answer would be the latter. It is the weakness of that social contract that has enabled, that has exacerbated these wars to take place, and generally this instability to be inflamed. So yeah, when I say is she about to snap, really, like, in the analyses that I've been offering and a lot of other comrades and other people participating in this conversation over the last 5 years have been offering around Ethiopia is whether we have to go back to the drawing board and look at how did this nation come to be, and is it a good enough agreement between peoples to see us into the next chapter. Ethiopia, although widely known as, and really takes advantage of its position as being widely known as the country that was never colonized in the African continent, is, in my opinion, the last standing colony on the African continent that never went through an official decolonial process. And I say official decolonial process with my fingers like this because it can be quite, it's a question as to whether the decolonial processes other African nations went through in this country actually equal genuine decolonization, or if we're all still in that process, right? But for Ethiopia, when everyone went through the process of freeing themselves from the colonial administrations, that had been created, upon these peoples and these lands, and establishing, their independent states, because we were considered a country that had, not only had not been colonized, but the only country to offend of colonialism. We did not go through this process. So I think that this is the historical foundation that's being brought to the forefront now. And I'm of the opinion, as one person, that the only actual solution for Ethiopia, and anything less than this is not good enough, is that we go to a referendum, and that all nations that are looking for self-determination, and have been looking for such for more than a century, get to decide once and for all whether Ethiopia is the political destiny that they want.
Okay. I think again, many people are going to be nervous about what then now would portend for both Ethiopia and for the region, so that if we start fracturing up Ethiopia, then would that lead to further instability, or do you think then this actually becomes a model where people can negotiate the agreements that came out of the OAU to respect colonial borders? Is this sort of a move towards sort of restructuring, if you will, a wider restructuring across the continent? Do you think that's something that can be done?
Yeah, I think it can be done, and if we think it can't be done, we should rethink that. I think this agreement to respect the colonial borders, I understand, is to mitigate um perhaps a what they call a kind of worms of conflict that will never end, and I understand the kind of rationality behind that. But when you're looking at the case of Ethiopia, whereby people never went through making that decision. There's actually never been a moment of political consensus amongst people who are contained within Ethiopia's borders to be part of that state. There's never been a single free and fair election in the country, even though there have been um, electoral events, let me call them that. But there's never been a moment, whether in this administration or previous administrations, where people have said, "I belong to the country Ethiopia." People have just been going along with and trying to make the best of the decisions made by political elite, both in the country, in the Horn, and internationally as part of the geopolitics. And in terms of instability, and yes, there is. Because what's going on in the country right now is you have these protracted wars, particularly in the Oromia region, where the context of my poem is located. You have this war that, yes, has its context in the last 5 years. The Oromia Liberation Army, is almost a new military entity in terms of maybe its leadership, its formation, who's part of it, but its idea and it as an institution has existed for about 50 years. And then before that, there was resistance connected to the same logic of struggle, I guess. So this war, yes, will continue until the political questions that it poses are answered. But those questions not being answered, too, we have to realize is creating instability. We have a huge migration crisis, a refugee crisis in the Horn of Africa that is mostly fueled by the conflict going on in Ethiopia. We have the highest internally displaced population in the world, or at least one of, if it isn't the most, if it isn't the highest internally displaced population, this is in Ethiopia. So the idea that we're more stable if we don't go to this arena of political decision making than we are now is not a logic that adds up to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that we are already in instability. So, and I would say that it's not just Ethiopia. I mean, across the continent, very few, if I don't think any country was formed through like sort of a consensus of its people, and that people have been asked whether they want to be part of Kenya, And in fact, if you look at Kenya's northeast, I mean, we've basically told people there who had voted to be part of Somalia that they can't, they couldn't be. So, I completely take your point. To go back to the poem, and you spoke about humanizing the conflict. What what does it look like? I'm sure you visit Oromo, you know people there. What does the what does the conflict actually look like from a personal, from a human point of view? How do people operate and navigate it?
That's a really great question, and I haven't been back home since 2 weeks 2 weeks before the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa. So I was back home in this means end of 2019 till the middle of 2020, and the war you know, has gotten significantly worse in the last 3 years, last 3 or 4 years. But it really looks like this line that I use. Each of the lines, all three of the, I guess, the stanzas in there where I refer to a particular, I don't know, life activity, where it's reading books under the mountains in Bale, or returning to the gaming shop in Nekemte, or plowing the land, in Finfinne, known as Addis Ababa. Um, these are examples that I drew, that I imagined people that I know who have suffered state violence, which includes being imprisoned, severely tortured, beaten, people who have had their families' houses burnt down, people who have had to become refugees because of this and other, reasons that look like this. I kind of imagined what, and if for some of those examples, it wasn't even imagining. I very much know that people went to the gaming shop in certain, location, or lived close by to this mountain and were teachers, and had to return to these activities after surviving insane instances of violence that when you hear about, you actually cannot imagine how a human being could then go back and do what you and I do on a daily basis, or you and I having not gone through these. So a question of how do people navigate it, my friend, I wish I knew. In fact, I don't know. It seems a strength beyond the capacity of the human being, but in fact, it's a human being that is doing this. And so, but it is this living in daily fear. It's this choosing hope and resilience despite this fear. It's this hope, it's this continuous hope. I was reading an article really recently written by a woman named Opseluba, who has a humanitarian organization that works in the western parts of Oromo, which is one of the areas very, very hard hit by this war, and by the government's crackdown on people, because, whenever it loses ground with the OLA, it comes in, it's kind of this, what you call, it's not really, anyway, this violence against civilians. And she's describing people who are in these internally displaced camps, bus stops, schools, pregnant women, people who have lost family members on the way, people who have seen family members raped, like just really horrific trauma and violence. And she goes, but everyone is very hopeful that they're going to return to the very houses that they've come from. And so, to the question of like, how do people get through this? I guess it's to remain believing that it's going to end and life is going to return to a sense of normalcy, at some point. And what it takes to conjure up that kind of hope, when I have the answer to that, I will let you know.
People tend to forget that this has been going on for a really long time. And there have been really lots of attempts to foster some sort of peace. I'd like you to talk about that. And when you say towards the end of the poem that let me just read it out again, that you don't want um, uh, and just another deal. It's so he says
Another
nobody
house, yeah.
wants peace more than the drought-stricken land. I feed forage on the daily. But I don't want a peace that can be undone by another deal made in another house that comes with another plane that drops yet another sound from the sky on my kitchen table. Dead again, that will not be my fate. Could you just speak about those lines? I thought they were really powerful lines, in terms of, yes, we want peace, but it's almost like we don't want a false peace. What do you exactly mean by that?
Thanks so much for asking me that question, Patrick, because it's a question that's really close to my heart. And it's a a as somebody who believes, or as someone who will never have the audacity to tell, I hope I will never have the audacity to tell someone facing the kinds of violences that when I describe in the poem, or that we've talked about in this interview, or that's available, documented in many other forms on the internet about what's going on in Oromia. Anyone facing that violence, I could never tell them not to defend themselves. I could never tell them to just wait in your house, to die, essentially, because that is a reality that they could face. There was a study, not a study, sorry, an example just last week that I reported on, whereby there were 5 kids, young people, all friends, sitting in at home watching TV. The military barged into their house, told them they're all part of the Oromo Liberation Army, killed them all on the spot. And this is one example of stuff that happens across Oromia daily. So I could never tell someone to not get up and go defend yourself against violence like this. And this is the foundation of why we have an armed resistance in Oromia. And this is the context in which we talk about peace now, is about these people like this disarming, is the definition that the international community, that the Ethiopian states, and that all the voices kind of around these two communities, this is how they've articulated peace, that these people must disarm so that we can no longer have a war in Oromia. And so I'm not interested, of course, young people to go back to their lives. Of course, I want these old people to go back to lives. There's one member of the OLA who's been armed since towards the end of the Derg. This is just before 1991, and he's still part of this armed force, and he refuses to disarm until he can see a peace in his home country that is sustainable, that works for everybody, that's genuine, and that isn't just the absence of people fighting each other, which is necessary, which is an integral part of it. I'm not saying it's not necessary. I'm not saying that's not causing people chaos. That's not causing instability in people's lives. What I'm saying is that it's not good enough after 50 plus years of suffering under these conditions to sign a deal that says this army puts down its guns, but then we continue as business as usual. The Ethiopian state is still scared of expanding its identity to be inclusive of all the nations and nationalities within that country. It's still heavy-handed violence whenever it senses any political dissent anywhere. We still have a leader who is intent on centralizing power within himself. This is not good enough. And I also wrote those lines in light of the fact that after the TPLF signed the deal with the Ethiopian government ending the 2-year war in Tigray, which, no longer having war in that part of, or in Tigray, yes, is important, but there has also been no process of justice for the 1 million, nearly 1 million people that died, and the hundreds of thousands that suffered otherwise through, displacement, rape, etc. And there has been a rush post that peace deal to replicate the same thing in Oromia. Great, we did it with the TPLF. Now let's get the OLA to do the exact same thing when the conditions are very different. The political relationships between these two forces, the TPLF and the OLA to the Ethiopian state are very different. The context of these wars are very different. And it's not possible, to have this victor's peace, essentially, which is what happened. You had a victor's peace achieved by the Ethiopian state in Tigray. And so this is what I say very literally. I do not want just another deal made in another house, whether that is, in Arat Kilo, where the palace is in Ethiopia, or whether this is in the White House, or this is in the EU, or wherever it is going to happen. What I want is a change in the conditions that led to this war to begin with.